Thank you very much. Can you all hear me decently well, I think? I can usually, all right, great. I can project. As Dominique said, my name is Mariah, and this is a culmination of a lot of things. I'll kind of go through and talk to y'all about how I see myself as a scholar, where I situate my work, and sort of where I've been and where I'm going a little bit today. I'm still getting used to this building. All of you are probably way more used to it than I am. But I consider myself to be a social science researcher, but I am all over the place. I've been in departments that are more humanities focused. I've been in English and rhetoric departments. I've been in true social science departments. I've worked on grants, as Dominique said, for the National Institutes of Health. So I am quite interdisciplinary in nature. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how I situate my research, and then if you have questions about how I sort of transition that into my role as a cultural critic, an advocate, a participant sort of in this research space, and also an educator, I'd love to talk about it later on in this talk if we have time. But typically what I think helps is I situate my research interest into buckets. I think it's really important as a researcher to think about kind of the areas more broadly that you're interested in, and then kind of build these projects out of them. So today I'm going to talk about 4 of these buckets, 2 of which are sort of messy in the middle right now. But my first bucket is popular social media users. That can be anything from a celebrity to a social media influencer, all the way down to maybe what you would consider to be an everyday person, just sharing basic information about their lives. And as you can see, I'm interested in wellness, so that typically means maybe someone who's going on a fitness journey, quote unquote, or all the way up into my work for the NIH, which is on women who are predisposed for or rather to be diagnosed with breast and ovarian cancer, so BRCA1 and BRCA2 individuals. And so that is kind of where I situate myself within sort of influencer culture, but then I'm also interested in more broadly the wellness industry, right? So what constitutes the wellness industry, who participates in it, and then how that wellness industry communicates about itself and how the people within the industry communicate about what it means to be well, who's allowed to be well, who's not allowed to be well, and how that sort of circulates on social and digital media, particularly right now, social media platforms. And then the fourth bucket I'm really interested in is this idea of credibility. What makes somebody credible, specifically in an online space? How do we think about authority? How do we think about trust? How do we think about expertise? And so I'm going to touch on a little bit of all of those things today, and you'll be able to see sort of where we are as we go through. So I started my work 8 years ago or so, out of my undergraduate degree, looking at social media influencers. And in 2016, influencers were sort of emerging in the way that we think of them today, but they've been around for a really long time, right? We had variations on opinion leaders decades and decades and decades ago, right? So people who we look to for advice, right? Maybe it's a peer, maybe it's a parent. And then as social media sort of came about, we started looking for people who were like us, who seemed to have a lot of influence and advice, and started taking that information from them, right? And so we, as influencer studies scholars, as I consider myself to be part of that group, they're changing the way that we obtain information, particularly within the wellness industry, and also how we consume content online, right? Some of that content can be educational. Some of it can be entertainment-based. Maybe it's about motivating us to make some sort of change in our lives, right? And influencers originally, right, back in 2016, 2017, when this work was first coming out, the definition was people who promote products and services predicated on their everyday lives and sort of do that on behalf of commercial brands or entities, right? So they sell us products and services that we might see useful in our everyday lives. However, over the last few years, we're starting to see that influencers do more than just promote products and services, right? They also promote habits and ideologies, religious doctrine, political rhetoric, right? They're doing a lot more than just telling us that we should drink the skinny tea or whatever it might be back in like 2016, 2017, 2018, right? They're making huge impacts in things like COVID communication, for example, right? Vaccine communication, for example. And so when we think about popular users, we sort of have to broaden that out a little bit. And so I situate myself within these 3 kind of constructs, right? So I'm interested in this concept of authenticity within the influencer industry. Does it even exist is a question that I ask myself on a daily basis, and I'm sure some of you who are, on your phones, on TikTok, on Instagram, might also have, that question in your mind. I'm also interested in platform politics, or how people move about the platforms. So how do influencers make themselves visible? How do they think about algorithms, specifically with the emergence of TikTok and the mass amount of people that joined that platform in 2020 and beyond? How do we think about who's visible within the wellness space, within influencer culture? And then again, that authority piece, right? How do we think about authority? Who's allowed to have authority over the body more specifically? And how has that shifted over time? So if I think about breaking all of these breaking them down, rather, not up, I think about the performance of authenticity, right? So a few years ago, somebody asked me, and they were like, how would you define authenticity in the influencer space? And to me, it's not real, quote unquote, in the way that we would think that it is, right? If I asked you to show me your authentic self in person, I might be able to grasp it a little bit. But online, it's about the performance, and it's about the expectation of the follower, right? We have certain expectations for influencers. If you are looking for information about COVID, right, and you go to an influencer, you're expecting them to act in a certain way, right? Brooke Duffy and Emily Hunt came out with an article about 5 years ago that says that influencers deal with this thing called the authenticity bind, right? So it's this idea that influencers need to be real enough, but not too real, that we then don't want to follow them anymore, right? Because they're aspirational to a certain point. We want to be like them, right? Research says that we follow people who either look like us or who we want to look like, right? Do the things that we want to do, either now or in the future, right? And so we don't want them to be too real, right? Because that is scary, and then they become real people. And we don't necessarily want that. We want them to be real enough that we still feel closely to them, right? We still have that, what's called a parasocial relationship. That relationship that we feel to those folks. And some of the work that I did in this space, 4 or 5 years ago, was mostly on how influencers think about their own authenticity presentation, right? So what we found was influencers rely on what's called an ethic of authenticity. So there's no really legal precedent, right, in the influencer industry besides one guideline that came out in 2015 that was because of Kim Kardashian, of all people, that says if you work with a brand, you have to tell people that you're working with a brand. Right? However, how many people do you think are hired to track that on a daily basis? Not very many, right? It's not really a thing that anyone's hired to do the job of. Maybe Kim Kardashian or Jennifer Lopez or somebody might be, tracked for doing that kind of behavior, but anybody who's between me, someone who has like 2,000 followers on Instagram, and Kim Kardashian, no one's really watching them. Right? And so we asked, when no one's watching you, how do you know what to do? How do you maintain this kind of authentic persona while also working with brands and trying to sell people stuff? And they told us, well, we think if we're being authentic or as real as we possibly can within this structure, then we're ethical. And we were like, well, there's no ethics, right? There's no ethical board. There's nothing telling you how you should act. And they say, well, you're probably right. Right? No one's telling us how we should act, so we get to decide on a day-to-day basis what that looks like. And when they eventually work with brands, they do what's called structured flexibility work, right? So they know that with every single brand that they work with, if they're trying to show up as their authentic selves or a presentation of their most authentic self within this space, they want to be able to serve what they think their audience wants of them, right? So what you all as an audience member might want out of your influencer, but also doing enough that they still get paid. Right? So it's this it's a big balancing act with these folks, right? And then when we move to platform politics, we want to know how influencers navigate this platform, right? How are they increasing their visibility while the industry is also becoming more professionalized, right? 2017, 2018, 2019, we're seeing an increase in influencers, right? We're also seeing an increase in businesses surrounding influencer culture. So we have this business called intermediary companies, or sometimes they're apps even, that connect a commercial brand to an influencer so that they can get paid to do work. We saw an increase in talent managers that were not managing what we consider to be a traditional media celebrity, but an influencer, right? There's tons of talent agencies and networks now. We also were seeing larger arms in traditional commercial brands like social media marketing arms that are working with influencers to create this kind of content. And so at this time, there's a lot of navigating going on, right? We're trying to turn a hobby into a full-time job. So what does that look like, right? We're looking at things like algorithmic lore, this idea that nobody really knows how the algorithm works, but you plug something in, and if you get something out that you like, you might be able to go share that with someone else. Who knows if it's gonna work for them or not, but that lore has become its own industry in and of itself. How many people have seen like a business coach online? It's like, I became so famous on Instagram and now I'm gonna charge you $3,000 so you can learn how to do it too, right? They're basing all of that off of algorithmic lore. They don't actually know. It's all anecdotal. And then we also have what's happening to outside industries called influencer creep, right? So the influencer navigation, what's happening online, our desire to present our personal brands to the world, people are required to do that now outside of influencers. Sophie Bishop wrote this paper, which is wonderful, it just came out last year, on artists. Even though they're not influencers, right? They feel this pressure to join social media and practice influencing in a very similar way. We see that with athletes, with the new NIL deals. We see that with musicians, always. Actors, of course. But then we also see that with political figures, too. Right? This influencer creep, the influencer culture and the way that we move about platforms is creeping into all these different outside areas, right? And then again, we've seen this shift in authority. So a long time ago, we had more dispersed knowledge overall, specifically within medicine. But this also works for things like religion and also the law, right? We had medicine men and medicine women that would travel around to small towns and take care of their individual folks. And then, 200 odd years ago, right? We started to institutionalize medicine through the creation of medical schools, right? Through the desire to enroll certain people in that medical school and to keep other people out. And we decided that authority was based entirely on institutional knowledge, right? We go to these people who have gone to school for so long, and that's where we get our medical advice. Is it wrong? Absolutely not, right? They've gone to school. We have experts for a reason, right? This conversation came up with Dr. Fauci during COVID. Right? But as the internet has sort of become this space for folks to share more of their what we call embodied or generational knowledge, specifically folks from marginalized groups who have, personally, I would consider every right to not go to their physician because of the historical sort of underpinnings of what's gone on in our country. Right? They're sharing that embodied knowledge that is just as valuable as institutionalized knowledge. And so now we're back to the space of dispersed knowledge again, and they're utilizing online spaces to share. And so what I want to know, right, is we know anecdotally that these people are here. There are people online who are making quite a bit of money, and some people who are making no money at all, just for the desire to share their information in the health and wellness space. I want to know how and why they got there. Right? How does this shift in authority work? How do they present themselves using platform politics, using authenticity, using kind of conversations around authority? You know, how are they making the wellness industry what it is and building up this huge space, right? So as the influencer industry is growing, so is the wellness industry. In 2023, it was noted that the wellness industry was worth $5.6 trillion globally. Trillion with a T, which is wild. By 2027, they're expecting it to grow to over $8 trillion across the world. So this wellness industry is making a lot of money, right? And when I say wellness, I mean like with a capital W. So everything you would consider to be wellness and well-being, from fitness, exercise, medicine, supplements, to spirituality, to self-care, to holistic health, to massage, to acupuncture, to Chinese medicine, right? This industry is gigantic. And there's a wide open space for us to start to understand how this works, right? And what's going on in this space, and why at the same time the influencer industry is growing, the wellness industry is growing as well. And part of what I think, based on my research over the last 8 years, is there's a responsibility, or rather, there's sort of this equal movement up. And I think that influencers are responsible for part of that, at least. Right? I think that the growth of wellness discourse, so wellness conversations, talk about wellness on the internet, and this kind of wide dispersal of knowledge and the low barrier to entry for people to get onto social media platforms, I say that generally, right, has potentially played a role in the growth of the wellness industry. And so I use, this is where kind of my like rhetoric-y English self comes out. I use this one scholar named Colleen Durkach. She's lovely. And she says that wellness discourse, so like the conversations that we have, the words that we use to talk about wellness, is self-generating. And basically what that means is there's no stopping point. So she explains wellness and the words that we use to talk about wellness as two parts, restoration and enhancement. So I use sleep as an example, right? So if you're not sleeping well, you might try to find things for you to be able to sleep better, right? Some recent ones include like basic things like melatonin or an eye mask, or what's going around TikTok over the last 6 months is mouth taping, right? Who wants to sleep with their mouth taped shut, right? To support your better sleep or whatever it is, right? But then, once you restore your sleep, once you've taped your mouth or gotten an eye mask or whatever you've gotten, right, you can always sleep better, right? You could buy the Oura ring so you could track your sleep and get all of that raw data. So when you wake up, it'll give you a grade from A to D about how well you slept, as if you didn't already know because you were the one who slept or did not sleep, right? You probably know if you got a C- sleep. But this self-generating, auto-poetic is what they call it, right? Rhetoric means that the wellness industry will always exist because there's never an end point, right? You can always get better and better and better and better. And there are always all of these different avenues that you can go down and all of this money that you can spend to find your way to an ending that probably isn't available, right? She says that wellness is always a moving target, right? So influencers will always serve to sustain this, right? They will always find something new, a new trend to hop on, a new product, a new lifestyle habit. I mean, I think the United States in the last 4 years is obsessed with habits, right? How many books about how to change your life, how to do your morning routine, do your nighttime routine, do your daytime routine, prep your meals, right? So many ways that we can consider wellness to be a moving target, right? And to sort of see how influencers have played a role in that. So when we finally get to this last bucket, and we get to this idea of how do these influencers do this thing, right? Because we all know that a 23-year-old girl from Idaho, I don't know, she doesn't have the same institutional knowledge as my 45-year-old physician that I see in the city of Chicago. However, I spend more time with that 23-year-old from Idaho, right, digitally, than I do with my physician. So we know that they are spending more time with us, that they are showing us this aspirational version of self. And then we also have this argument that was made in 2016 by two internet scholars, Crystal Abbott and Mart Otts, and they say that credibility and authenticity are the two core norms of the influencer industry. So they say in order to be a successful influencer, you need to have two things. But what happened in the article is they went really deep into authenticity, defined it, operationalized it, and then everybody over the last 8 years has taken that chapter and said, authenticity, authenticity, authenticity. It was even supposed to be like the word of the year last year or something, right? Except nobody was talking about credibility. There's hardly an operationalization, hardly a definition of what credibility actually is, right? Some people would even say that credibility is being authentic, right? How do you decipher those terms? And so what I decided to do, now we're finally up to 3 years ago, 2021, if you've been following my tangent, that credibility is important for influencers, right? We know that's the argument, right? It's used as sort of this fallback if they get called out or criticized. But I didn't actually know how we were measuring credibility. So I had to pull out from outside of communication, or rather outside of internet studies, particularly outside of the rhetoric, right, the wellness stuff. And I found celebrity endorsement literature. So in the 80s, we had this huge boost of literature that was talking about the celebrities in the United States specifically that were promoting stuff in the 80s on television, right? We don't see it as often anymore because we have social media, but the amount of television ads, Oprah was a huge celebrity endorser, right? Now I'm blanking on all the names, but I'm sure you have somebody in your head that you're like, I know that this person was on TV, right? Telling us to buy this one shake or to buy the like shake weight things, right? It was like QVC, right? Except with celebrities. And what I had seen was these celebrity endorsement literature folks were like, we're gonna test what makes these celebrities credible. And so they utilized an existing theoretical framework called source credibility theory. And basically what that means is or what they say it means, is that there are 3 different constructs that make somebody credible in the eyes of their audience. It's a combination of expertise, which is either embodied or through institutional knowledge, trustworthiness, which means that you trust the influencer, or rather the celebrity in this case, to do right by you, right? So you don't think that they're trying to trick you. That's an evidence of trust, right? And then attractiveness. Attractiveness can be a lot of things. It can be likability, it can be similarity, so you look like the person. It could be, like I mentioned before, you want to look like them, or you just think that what they look like makes them look credible. For example, we found in previous studies that a fitness influencer with a six-pack is gonna do better with someone without, right? Because you see in their body that they have successfully made their body into whatever it is. We idealize that, and we wanna get what they have, right? So it's some kind of combination of these 3 things. And what I wanted to do was turn it on its head a little bit. Actually, let's go back so you can see that. So I said, all of these people are looking from the audience perspective, right? They're saying, as an audience member, what do you look for? But I wanted to say, as an influencer, what are you trying to show? And does it map on to this idea of credibility? Because influencers who are sharing things about COVID, right, about vaccines, there's a huge uptick right now in doula influencers, so women who, and men who are trying to support people who are having babies, right, in a less institutionalized fashion, right? They're building up some kind of credibility, and they know that they have to share credibility. So how are they doing that? And are they thinking about these 3 constructs using these words or otherwise? So then I decided to do this project. So now we're sort of close to present day, right? So I did a digital ethnography, which means I spent time over 2 years taking detailed notes of the digital wellness space with 30 influencers across the space that cover a variety of topics. I also interviewed all 30 of them in 2021 to see if what they say they do matches up to what they actually do. And then finally, 2 years ago, year and a half ago, I did a content analysis of a whole bunch of Instagram and TikTok content, videos, posts, captions, you name it, to get more of a broad example of what the wellness industry looks like in relation to credibility. And this is what I found. So this piece came out last year, and it looks at how source credibility theory maps on to the wellness influencer industry. And what I found is, yes, these 3 concepts, influencers are thinking about them, right? They're thinking about how to get you to trust them. They're thinking about how to show that they have expertise. They're thinking about how to create aspirational aesthetic content, showing themselves in the best light possible, right? Sometimes that means not the best light possible to try to prove their authenticity, right? There's this balance that's happening. But what I also found that wasn't so much in the previous literature is that who they are as people, their positionality, their identity matters. And anecdotally, we're like, well, duh, right? For example, in one of my interviews, a white 25-year-old influencer from Florida told me that she has never once considered promoting her certifications that she has in nutrition because no one's ever asked. She has it there just in case, like somebody, is like, I don't think you know what you're doing. But then a black woman that I spoke to in North Carolina told me that she always, every time she films a TikTok, says who she is and what her certifications are at the very beginning of the video, and she still gets called out, right? Of course, right? Anecdotally, we know that, the history of our country. But what's not happening in the research, right, is we say there's a balance of expertise, trust, and attractiveness, but we're not thinking about who the people are that are sharing the message and who they're attempting to share it with. Right, so this idea of positionality as an overlay, an umbrella concept that covers these 3 components of source credibility theory in the wellness influencer industry helps us understand why some folks are sometimes seen as more credible than others and what influencers are doing to sort of combat that, right? The second piece that came out of this large project is on black squares, or rather, it's called Black Squares for Black Lives, right? So remember back in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously with the murder of George Floyd, right? So when I interviewed folks in 2021, I was like, what were the big things that happened in the wellness industry in 2020? And me, being the ignorant woman that I am in my privileged position, I was like, everyone's gonna talk about COVID, right? Some people did, as the one primary biggest thing that ever happened. But the majority of them talked about how the wellness industry has intersected with social movements, specifically Black Lives Matter, right? And so what we did was we continued to talk to people about what it means to start inserting these social movement conversations inside of the wellness industry. Because when I started interviews, so many folks told me the wellness industry and social media at large is not a space for politics, quote unquote, right? It's a space for entertainment, to get away from real life. But when I spoke to other people, the conversation we had was, for some folks, existing and living in the wellness industry is a political statement, y'all, right? Like being alive and trying to create longevity for your communities and share knowledge that is embodied or generational is a political statement, is a movement. And we can't necessarily say that the wellness industry is a non-political space, right? And so what I did was I talked to these 30 folks about what that summer looked like for them, paying attention to sort of their positionality again in the space. And what we found was that during the Black Lives Matter movement, during this sharing of the black squares, if people remember, it wasn't even supposed to be for the mass public. It was actually supposed to be in support of the music industry and to show allyship with the Black folks with which the music industry in the United States was built on the backs of, right? And so what happened was we played like a terrible game of telephone and ended up where everybody was sharing the black squares and using the Black Lives Matter hashtag. And what happened was all of the information that we were sending to the people who were on the front lines who were protesting, all that information was gone because of the amount of folks that were sharing the black squares without having any idea why they were sharing it, right? And in the wellness industry, we had audiences asking folks to share for one of the very first times where they align politically, whether they support Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, whether they choose to not say anything and what that says about their privilege. Right? So this piece looks specifically at that performative allyship, specifically white women who had never spoken up about a social movement before, that were in the wellness industry, that were being called out and asked to share their opinions on it, and what sort of happened as a result. This paper, not to toot my own horn as I'm here doing that the whole 35 minutes,